That portion of northwestern Ohio, situated to the southeast of the Black Swamp, was but sparsely settled at the close of the first quarter of the present century. The hardy pioneers who had left their New England homes to open up the western wilds here and there built their modest, dense dwellings and tilled the few acres won from the dense forest and luxuriant prairie. The dusky aborigines, driven from all other parts of Ohio, clung tenaciously to this latter place. Retaliations were a comparatively neglected spot, and the smoke from the log hut of the settler rose within sight of the Indian wigwam. The two races were at peace with each other, for neither cared to convert a passive neighbor into an active enemy. The Indians had realized their inability to drive back the constantly advancing wave of civilization, and the white settlers had no desire to provoke the savage retaliations of their dusky neighbors unless compelled by necessity to do so. In the neighborhood of the junction between the Sandusky and Timocta rivers in Wyandot County, a remnant of the once powerful Wyandot tribe remained. One of their villages was at Upper Sandusky and another at Springville in Seneca County. A small band of Senecas were also located in the neighborhood, and some scattered Ottawas had their wigwams on Blanchard's Fork, a few miles to the west of the Wyandot settlements. An Indian trail led from Upper Sandusky to Springville, and thence through the Black Swamp to Perrysburg. At the latter place it crossed the Maumee and reached the shore of the Detroit River opposite Maiden in Canada. Some of the Indians living in the northwest of Ohio had sided with the British in the War of 1812, and these annually crossed over to Maiden to receive their presents of guns, ammunition, and blankets. The Canadian Indians sometimes visited their dusky brethren in Ohio, and thus the trail was frequently traversed. Among the settlers who had located themselves in the neighborhood of the Wyandot villages was Elijah Brayton, a thrifty farmer from New England, who had established himself near the Timocta River in what is now Crawford Township, Wyandot County. In the year 1825, Mr. Brayton was 39 years of age, and his family consisted of his wife and their 6 children, William, Harriet, Lucy, Matthew, Mary, and Peter. In that year, Mr. Brayton was busy erecting a mill on Thymersites, and towards the fall of the year, he went to Chillicothe to bring up the millstones. The journey at that time was long and tedious, and the home affairs were entrusted in his absence to Mrs. Brayton and the eldest son, William, then a lad of 16. On the 20th of September, 1825, William Brayton, with his younger brother Matthew, then nearly 7.5 years old, started to hunt up some stray cattle. They proceeded for 2 or 3 miles in the direction of the spot where William Brayton at present lives, but found no traces of the missing cattle. Here they met a neighbor, Hart, who was also looking for stray cattle. Matthew had become tired and declared his inability to proceed any further. After a short consultation was intersected, it was agreed that William Brayton and Hart should proceed in search of the cattle, and that Matthew should take the path that led to the house of Mr. Baker, about 60 rods distant, where he could amuse himself with his young playmates until the return of William. The two went out on their cattle-hunting expedition, leaving little Matthew to pursue his way along the narrow and ill-defined path. At the close of the day's search, William Brayton called at Mr. Baker's house for his little brother. To his astonishment, he learned that Matthew had not been seen by any of the family. He then turned his steps homeward, thinking that Matthew had changed his mind and gone home, but on arriving there, no tidings of the missing boy met him. The alarm and apprehension that filled the breast of the mother may be conceived. 1,000 fearful thoughts flitted through her mind in rapid succession, but no time was lost in useless grieving. The men and women who braved the dangers of frontier life were quick to think and prompt to act. A little party turned out at once to search for the missing boy and restore him, if possible, to the anxious household. From the spot where the brothers had parted, the path to Mr. Baker's house was narrowly searched, and the marks of the child's feet were discernible. At no great distance from the commencement of the path, it was intersected by a track made by some logs recently drawn from the woods. At this point, the traces showed that Matthew had stopped in doubt. They also showed that he had finally taken the log track in mistake for the regular path. Up that track his little footsteps were traced for some distance, but after a while they became fainter and at last disappeared altogether. The woods on the margin of the track were searched in vain for traces of his feet. The Indian trail, before spoken of, crossed the log track where the footsteps became invisible, and he might have taken that trail. But his footmarks he had followed that path had been obliterated by the feet of passing Indians. The party sorrowfully returned from their unsuccessful search and met the anxious mother with heavy hearts. The night that followed was one of sleepless agony for Mrs. Brayton. To what suffering or dreadful fate her little boy might be subjected, it was impossible to conjecture, but the night and the lonely woods were fraught with dangers to him and with terror to her. The absence of the father at this critical juncture on so long and distant a journey aggravated the troubles and distress of the time. Morning broke at last, and never was daylight more eagerly welcomed. With the first dawn of light, messengers set out in all directions for assistance, and soon the woods were astir with searching parties. The Indian villages were examined, but the Wyandots professed entire ignorance as to the movements of the missing boy and joined with much zeal in the search. The relations between the Braytons and the Wyandots had been of the most friendly character, and there seemed to be no possible reason for their interfering with the peace of that family. They stated, however, that a party of Canadian Indians had passed up the trail on the day that the boy disappeared, but could not say whether he had been carried off by that party or not. Another night came, and again the sorrowful mother met the dejected hunters at her door and received no consolation. At daybreak the parties again set out to search new tracts of country, but all without avail. Mr. Bow, still remembered in the neighbourhood, acted as storekeeper of the party and filled the bags of the searchers with meals as they returned from their long expeditions. The settlers for many miles around turned out in the exciting hunt. Days lengthened into weeks, and then it became evident that all further searches were useless. Every foot of territory for miles around had been examined. No trace of the lost child could be discovered. He could scarcely have wandered off and perished by starvation or wild beasts, for in either case some trace would have been left. The only inference remaining was that he had been snatched up by the party of Canadian Indians and carried off into hopeless slavery, if not to meet a horrible death. Pursuit now was useless, had the boy been thus carried off, and the search was reluctantly abandoned. Meantime, Mr. Brayton had returned from his journey, and the sad affliction that had befallen his house fell with a crushing weight on his heart. He bore up nobly for the sake of his wife and remaining children, but his distress was keen, and every straw of hope that floated by was eagerly clutched at. From time to time came vague rumours of the boy having been seen in different directions, and the faintest hope of success sufficed to send off the bereaved father or some trusty messenger to follow up the clue, but always without success. The last information that assumed the appearance of probability was received in 1829 from a man who had been travelling among the Indian tribes of Illinois, and who asserted that he had seen among the Indians of that country a white child whose age and appearance corresponded generally with that of the missing Matthew Brayton. Without an hour's delay, Brayton wrote to General Cass, then Indian Commissioner, but his answer crushed out the last remnant of hope. The letter bade the anxious father renounce all hope based on such a rumour, for there was no such white child among the Indians of Illinois. On what authority the general based his assertion cannot be said, but it is more probable that he was mistaken in this. The weary years passed on, but brought no comfort to the stricken households. As all strong impressions fade in the comfort over time, so faded away the memory of the loss from the minds of men. But deep in the hearts of the parents remained the image of the lost boy, and the thrilling scenes and emotions connected with the search for him recurred again and again, long after others had nearly forgotten the incidents. The father never forgot him. His lost Matthew was ever in his heart, and his name was often on his tongue. The oldest brother, William, could not forget him, for the mother's reproaches, silent or spoken, for his neglect in sending so young a boy alone on such a path, sank deep into his heart. And could the mother that bore him forget the missing lamb of the fold? The paling cheek, the wasting form, and the decaying strength told how deep the love, how bitter the anguish of the mother for her lost son. If she were but sure of his fate, if but one rag of his clothes, but a particle of his body, had remained to assure her that her darling had perished by wild beasts or been slain by still wilder men, It would at least have given rest to her weary heart, but this torturing mystery was too great to be borne. So the years dragged slowly onward, and each succeeding anniversary of her boy's loss drove the sharp grief still deeper into her heart, until 16 years after the loss she tired of this world, and the peaceful turf closed over her sorrows. In her last thoughts, the memory of the lost boy had a place. She died of a broken heart. Matthew Brayton was born on April 7th, 1818, and was, therefore, 7 years, 5 months, and 13 days old at the time of his loss.